When you're getting ready and planning to deploy Veeam Backup and Replication and/or Veeam ONE, one of the most critical components to pay close attention to actually isn't even a Veeam component at all. Instead, it's the required Microsoft SQL Server database on the back end that both of these applications rely on for proper operation. Oftentimes, it's a simple decision of whether or not you go with the default installation of these Veeam applications, which will bundle in a SQL Server Express installation, or do you bring your own license and go full-blown paid SQL? However, as you'll see on the lightboard here in just a few moments, there's a lot more considerations to pay attention to with regards to database sizing and planning and location of where you put the database, as well as certain limitations that are oftentimes overlooked with the built-in SQL Server Express instance, even for small-scale deployments. So let's take a look on the lightboard at some of those considerations that you want to be mindful of when you're planning and implementing Veeam Backup and Replication and/or Veeam ONE.
Okay, now that we're at the lightboard, let's take a little bit deeper look into one of the very important components of both Backup and Replication as well as Veeam ONE, and that's the Backend SQL Server. And many times when you go through your preliminary discussion and deployment design and scenario, a lot of times there's not enough thought that gets placed on the SQL Server backend. With our product, Veeam Backup and Replication, as well as Veeam ONE, both of those products out of the box are fully installable on a single machine, and we do that by packaging in a Microsoft SQL Server Express installation. Now, as many of you probably well know, SQL Server Express does carry with it a few limitations, such as only being able to leverage up to 4 cores on the first CPU and only 1 CPU total. You also have that maximum 10 gig database size limitation. And a lot of times you may be looking at deploying Veeam Backup and Replication or Veeam ONE into smaller environments where potentially a single CPU would be powerful enough, but that database size limitations is oftentimes overlooked. And case in point would be if you have a SQL Server yourself that you're looking to protect, or Microsoft Exchange or SharePoint, Active Directory domain controllers. We do have Veeam Explorers that make recovering granular items from those applications very easy. However, if your database that we're protecting with those respective applications happens to be over 10 gigabytes, you will not be able to leverage the Explorers without first setting up a staging SQL Server. So again, just a few things to consider when you're looking at the overall placement and addition in this case of what you use for Microsoft SQL. Now, when we first focus our attention on Veeam Backup and Replication, we have essentially 2 different deployment models, and we've coined those simple and distributed. Now, when you look at the difference between a simple deployment and distributed deployment, this is probably going to look very obvious because distributed does what? It distributes out the components across multiple machines. Simple is simply taking everything that Veeam Backup and Replication packages, and you're going to be installing it on one single machine. Now, what are we talking about when we say components? And for those of you who already know Veeam Backup and Replication, you know we have things like the VBR server itself, and that's essentially the shell, the GUI, the actual interface where you're doing all of your job management, your scheduling, and facilitating recoveries. But we also have what's called a proxy, and the proxy is essentially doing all the data movement. It's doing your reads from the source location. It's doing all the heavy lifting as well, so the compression, the data deduplication, and then ultimately writing to the target repository, which, by the way, is another component. Now, with regards to our repositories, they can be any Windows-based machine, a Linux machine, they can be a CIF share, they can be object storage in many cases for a second and third tier backup location. So the idea is a repository is where the backups are going to reside. Now, when you look at a simple deployment and you walk through the Veeam installation wizard, all of those key fundamental components will be deployed on a single machine. Now, coupled with the repository is also a new component called the mount server. And the mount server is going to be responsible for doing what it says, taking the Veeam backup files and mounting them in such a way that you can actually browse the contents and choose what it is you want to recover. Now, the mount server is also fundamentally critical if you have multiple locations, because if you did, let's say, a simple deployment, but you put a repository way over here at another location, but the mount server was at the primary, the original location, what would happen is if you had a backup file over here that Veeam had created, this mount server would have to go across the internet to that backup file and mount it all the way back across before you would ever get any type of GUI to select which item you want to recover. And as you might imagine, this is not an ideal situation. It would take exponentially more time, and in some cases, you would never actually be presented with the UI to choose what it is you want to recover. So when you look at the distributed model, you still have the same fundamental components, but the difference is you're going to be deploying these on multiple machines. Now, these machines can be physical machines or, of course, virtual machines, and it allows you to distribute those components not only at a single geo or a single site, but if you do have multiple locations, you may have a proxy here. You may also want to deploy a proxy over here. A repository can exist over here. That way you have the added benefit of having your components across multiple locations, but they can all be managed by a Veeam Backup and Replication server that resides at the main location. So the idea here is you're distributing out all your components. Now, what does this have to do with SQL, right? So these are the Veeam components, but the reason I'm laying this out is because so many times this is what we focus on when we're thinking about doing a deployment. Where's my proxy going to go? Where and how many repositories am I going to install? What's the bandwidth look like? So there's a lot of these considerations that go into play when you're architecting out your design scenario until we get to SQL. And oftentimes, this is a checkbox. It's something that doesn't really get a lot of thought. Not a lot of sizing calculations goes into this. And granted, we can't cover everything on this Lightboard session that we otherwise would in our Veeam Advanced Design and Optimization course. But just to give you guys some idea, when you're looking at general sizing, if you have an environment that has over 500 virtual machines, you want to consider going with a full-blown SQL install and SQL instance, not the built-in SQL Server Express that the product ships with. Also, another consideration, if you're doing file to tape, so FTT, if you can make out my handwriting there. So if you're doing a lot of file to tape jobs, this can cause the database to grow very rapidly and could exceed that 10 gigabyte maximum allowed database size in the Express instance. Also, I've already mentioned this. What about the Explorers? This is a huge one because I feel like often too many times you've got those applications. You may not be in as big of an environment that would necessarily justify an extra expense of a full enterprise blown SQL install, but you do have some of those critical applications like Exchange. If your Exchange database is 11 gigabytes, you will not be able to leverage the Veeam Explorers unless you have a staging server. And in many cases, if you're going to go to the trouble of setting up and configuring a staging server, sometimes it's just easier to start with Veeam Backup and Replication having access to that full-blown SQL installation. Now, with regards to where the SQL Server is deployed, so that's another question mark. So we've talked about the built-in SQL Server Express versus full-blown SQL. And of course, there are more considerations. We have best practice guides that we can link you to that goes through the full list of things you want to consider. But as far as placement is concerned, if you're doing the simple deployment, that means SQL is also going to be deployed on that same machine. And more times than not, it's going to be SQL Server Express because that's what's shipped with the product. Now, you do have the added ability of separating that out. So you can do Veeam Backup and Replication, which will be the GUI, as I mentioned, and then you have the option of where to actually install the database. So the database can be on the same machine, or it can be on a different dedicated machine. Now that again can be physical or virtual, entirely up to you. The one consideration you need to remember though is this Veeam GUI, so the shell, the actual interface that you navigate and manage your environment in, will not and cannot open if it does not have access to the backend database. And this is critical because a lot of times, that could technically introduce additional options for a failure or potential added complexities you don't want to deal with, because for whatever reason, if the GUI, let's just look at this, let's consider this the UI. So if this is the UI and you've got it connected down here to another SQL server, okay, if that's SQL and something happens to this link, that UI will not open, which means you can't get in there to actually do a recovery of potentially that machine. So again, you could almost be locked out of the house, if you will, if you don't have that link established. Now, there are certainly ways around this because we do have what's called a config backup, okay? So when we do a configuration backup, we're effectively backing up all the configuration parameters that exist on that SQL server. So worst case scenario, if that scenario happened, you could install Veeam fresh, or maybe you already have a secondary standby copy of Veeam pre-installed. Then you would simply take that configuration database and restore it. Okay, so you could restore it back to a new SQL installation or potentially back to the old installation if you could access it. So there are ways around that. Now, SQL always on availability groups are supported. Clustering is supported on the SQL Server side. So if you guys want to set that up on the back end, we have KBs on how to configure Veeam so it will work that way. So there are options to create that high availability. But when you're looking at performance, keep in mind, if you do decide to deploy full-blown SQL on another machine, take note of the connection that Veeam, the backup and replication server, will use to reach out to that SQL server. Okay, that's also critical. And when we shift our focus over to Veeam ONE, so Veeam ONE carries with it a lot of the same fundamental concepts. So again, Veeam ONE, it's a little bit different verbiage. So you have essentially the same thing. You have simple, but then instead of distributed, it's known as advanced. And to be honest, these are just terms that we've given different ways to go about deploying your Veeam components, right? So in the simple design, just like with VBR, you have all of your Veeam ONE components installed in the same machine. So you have the client, the Veeam ONE client, you'll have the web UI, okay, and then you also have an agent. Now, when you first install Veeam ONE, the actual Veeam ONE server, so whatever machine you make the Veeam ONE server, will be the machine that's responsible for communicating with your virtual environment, your physical environment via your agents, your Veeam Backup and Replication install. That is effectively the single point of communication and data aggregation from your virtualized infrastructure, okay? The web UI is Veeam ONE Reporter. That's actually the web interface that you can access from any machine as long as you can, of course, talk to the Veeam ONE server. And that's where you go and generate your Veeam ONE reports from. That's where you set up scheduled reports if you want those reports generated periodically in an automated fashion. And lastly, the agent. This is one of the newer things that we've introduced with Veeam ONE. And the agent has a server edition and a client edition. And the server edition is deployed on the Veeam ONE server. And it's responsible for communicating with your Veeam Backup and Replication servers, pulling in the logs and actually aggregating that data so that we can perform intelligent diagnostics. And this gives us the ability to actually check and see if there are common misconfigurations with your Veeam Backup and Replication deployment, as well as your virtual environment. And in the paid edition of these products, we can even automate the resolution to that. So again, you've got remediation actions, Veeam Intelligent Diagnostics. You've got all that enabled via that agent connection. And the client version of the agent gets installed on the VBR, the Veeam Backup and Replication servers. All of that can be on one machine and simple. Advanced, just like with VBR, you're just separating out those components onto different machines. So you can actually have the Veeam ONE server by itself with no web UI on one machine. Then you can put the web UI on another machine. So if this is the web, this can be the Veeam ONE server, and you'll still want to deploy the server agent on the actual Veeam ONE server itself so that it can communicate with your Veeam Backup and Replication installs if you do have more than one. Now again, we go back to the whole purpose of this video. What about SQL? Where does SQL live? What are some things to keep in mind and consider? So when you look at the actual SQL side of this, just like Veeam Backup and Replication, you can deploy a full-blown SQL instance away from the main Veeam ONE server. Typically with Veeam ONE, you want to start looking at this if you have over 1,000 virtual machines, not the 500 of Veeam Backup and Replication. Now, if you do have environments that are larger than 1,000 VMs, we definitely do recommend a full-blown instance of SQL and a separate full-blown instance of SQL. You don't want that full-blown SQL instance to be on the same machine that the Veeam ONE server installation resides on. You want those on different boxes, whether they physical or virtual. It's up to you. So those are some considerations there with regards to the SQL backend. Now, again, just like with VBR, you do have what's known as the Veeam ONE client. So the Veeam ONE client is a very lightweight application that you could install on anybody's workstation, whether it's a laptop, a desktop PC, you name it, as long as it's Windows-based at this time. And the purpose of this client is to communicate to the actual Veeam ONE server. So that client will automatically be installed on the Veeam ONE server installation. But if you want to enable multiple users to actually look at alerts, to manage alarms, to see performance metrics in Veeam ONE Monitor, you can allow them to install that on their terminal, their machine. And as long as they can communicate with the Veeam ONE server, they can simply enter in its DNS with their credentials, and they will have that same Veeam ONE Monitor client view that you would otherwise see on the actual Veeam ONE server. Now, what happens though, if you do the advanced deployment, and let's say you do SQL, full-blown instance of SQL because you have 2,000 VMs, and it's different on a different machine than the Veeam ONE server. So what happens if something breaks this link? Same situation. No UI will open. And that's the whole thing that's very important to consider when you start doing distributed deployments and you separate the SQL backend from the dependent application, which in this case is VBR or Veeam ONE. It's imperative that you pay special attention to that link. Maybe you do multiple connection paths. Maybe you do NIC teaming. Maybe there's ways that you improve the throughput of that link, because now whenever you run reports in Veeam ONE, we're actually pulling all that metric historical data that we've aggregated and written to our SQL database. We're actually pulling that now externally, because remember, you have the web UI piece, but you also have the SQL backend. So when you actually activate a Veeam ONE report, you're on the web UI, which then has to go talk to the remote SQL database to generate that report. So pay special attention to the performance that you put into your Veeam SQL backends, not only from a throughput perspective, but from an IOP perspective. If you're a customer that has 5,000 or 10,000, maybe 20,000 VMs, a really, really large deployment, and you want to deploy Veeam ONE, you really should pay super special attention to how powerful and how much horsepower you pump into that backend SQL database. Because remember, we've got one Veeam ONE server that's responsible for all the data aggregation across the board, and it has to save data somewhere. And where it saves it is that SQL database. So for the UI to perform snappy and responsively and not lag, the actual connection and the performance of the SQL server is paramount. So guys, hopefully you found this a little bit informative. I just wanted to make sure that we reviewed one of the fundamental key components that a lot of times gets overlooked in design scenarios. A lot of times it's a checkbox. Do you want The default installation was SQL Server Express, yes or no? If not, okay, we've got an enterprise license of SQL Server. Go deploy it. There's not a lot of consideration that goes into, well, how are you going to communicate with it? What type of performance do you need to give it? What's the minimum IOP expectation out of it? How many objects are we going to be writing in? What's the size of the infrastructure? So again, please, pay special attention to your SQL Server backend requirements of Veeam Backup and Replication, as well as Veeam ONE. And don't forget, there's a really good best practices guide, and there's a ton of documentation on veeam.com if you want to get into the weeds a little bit deeper on even more certain, considerations you want to pay special attention to when you get into these more distributed style deployments. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.